Good afternoon and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Jonathan Beck, Director of Content. Our guest today is Gershon Baskin. He's the Middle East Director of the International Communities Organization, ICO. Mr. Baskin is a veteran journalist who has written in many Israeli and Arabic-speaking newspapers, and also, importantly, has been a back-channel negotiator in ceasefire deals, also in the deal that brought the release of Gilad Shalit, and in the current war, in the talks with Hamas that are currently not going anywhere, and we'll discuss this in a minute. So, first of all, thank you for joining us at such a short notice, Mr. Baskin.
My pleasure.
Can you basically just walk us through something you wrote on X yesterday, I think, around midday, about negotiations during the Shalit era and today?
Yeah, well, I started negotiating with Hamas a week after Gilad Shalit was abducted back in June of 2006, actually the beginning of July 2006, and I've been in contact with Hamas for 18 years now. Those negotiations led to several ceasefires that were arranged during different periods of warfare between Israel and Gaza, and of course led to the breakthrough that enabled Gilad Shalit to be returned in the hostage deal that was signed in October of 2011. Following that, I was negotiating with Hamas for a brief period of time on a long-term ceasefire until Israel took out Ahmed Jabari, who was the head of the Ezzedin al-Qassam military force of Hamas in November of 2012, and those negotiations ended then. In 2015, when I learned about Avera Mengistu, the Ethiopian Israeli, and later Hisham Asayed, the Bedouin Israeli, who were in Gaza, and then, of course, the bodies of two Israeli soldiers, Oron Shaul and Hadar Godin, I started making inquiries with Hamas about what were the terms for attaining their release. I made contact with the Israeli, who was the coordinator of missing people and hostages at the time, Lior Lotan, and explained to him that I had connections in Hamas. He, of course, knew my name from the Shalit deal. And I started trying to do the deal. It continued into the time that Yaron Blum took over the position. And basically, for about 8 years or so, I tried to help to secure the release of those 4 Israelis who were in Gaza. The talks were dead-ended, even though progress had been made over the course of years, but it wasn't enough to secure their release because the bottom line was that Hamas demanded that Israel release Palestinian prisoners who were serving life sentences for killing Israelis. And the Israeli side refused to release even a single prisoner who was serving a life sentence for killing Israelis. That's basically what it came down to. Even though at one time I had learned of a number of Palestinian prisoners who were over the age of 65 and who had already spent more than 20 years in prison, and suggested that Israel release them, and perhaps that would be enough to make a deal. But there was no one on the Israeli side who was interested in doing it. The value of the civilian prisoners in the eyes of the Israelis in charge, and of course, the dealing with bodies of 2 soldiers was not enough to push Israel to make a deal that Hamas would accept. Those talks ended pretty much when Yaron Blum resigned. The task was given over to Netanyahu's military attaché, General Avi Gil. I met with Avi Gil twice, I think, in the Prime Minister's office. I spoke to Tzachi Hanegbi, the National Security Advisor, several times on trying to negotiate a deal, but it was clear that the Israeli side was not interested. And then the war on October 7th happened. And that changed our reality, and everything that we've known before then and everything that we know since then has changed. And I tried very early on. In fact, the first deal that was made was actually the result of parameters that I put on the table and helped to push forward. When I learned how many women prisoners and how many teenage prisoners there were in Israel, and that they were all from the West Bank and no important Hamas people, and none of them had killed any Israelis, and then started talking to Hamas about releasing women, children, elderly, wounded, and sick. In the end, the deal was women and children. But I started laying the foundation of that deal probably from the second week of the war. Of course, it was done on official channels, and I was in contact with the Egyptians and the Qataris. But of course, that deal was done by the government of Israel. And they take credit for it, due credit that goes to them. The mistake that was made that they didn't continue the deal past the day 7 because of what they called Hamas violations. Nonetheless, it was a huge mistake on the part of Israel not taking back anyone that Hamas was willing to release at that time. And we've seen the results since then.
Okay, I understand. I don't know which language you did those talks in, etc. Can you characterize the other side in the talks? Can you characterize Hamas, what they demand, what's their red lines, what's our red lines?
Yeah, my experience with Hamas is there's definitely a change that happened after October 7th. Hamas that was much more willing to talk.
Before you continue, just to put this in context, yeah, just like about an hour before this, today was the first day of school, very moving day for many Israelis, and we woke up with very sad news about, the 6 hostages that were killed. Now, about an hour before this briefing, more details came out. At least I read this in the Hebrew version of Haaretz, that they were shot in the head, so basically executed by Hamas just before they were rescued. So, just to put everything in context, on the one hand, this is kind of an, I told you so moment for the people who say no military solution can bring them back. But on the other hand, we did have some successful rescue operations. And also, it does teach us something about, the enemy we're facing. I mean, I really just, before the talk, they were, from what I read, they were shot in the head, but in generally good health. They would have survived unless they were killed. According to what I'm guessing is like Hamas's rules of engagement when the Israeli army approaches. So,
yeah, I think it's really important to remember that the military pressure does not release hostages. 8 hostages were rescued in military operations. There are still 101 hostages in Gaza. There is no Entebbe here. There's no brilliant rescue where they're going to fly in and save all the Israeli hostages. And if something is learned from what we learned last night when these hostages' bodies were found, is that military pressure will not save them. Military pressure will kill them. Very early in the war, someone in Hamas said that they would begin to execute Israeli hostages like Daesh, like ISIS did on television. That was retracted very quickly by the Hamas leadership in Doha at the time, who said we wouldn't do that. But it's very clear now, almost 11 months into the war, that this is going to be their mode of operation. Their backs are against the wall. They have lost most of their personnel. They don't have a structured army anymore. And we can expect that if Hamas soldiers, fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, are holding hostages, and they hear Israeli soldiers approach them, they're going to kill them. This should also be a clear message to Benjamin Netanyahu, who I think believes that if only we find Yahya Sinwar and kill him, the hostages will be freed. What I've been saying for months now is that there is no reason to believe that once we kill Yahya Sinwar, that they will free the hostages. It is much more likely that once their leader is killed, that they will kill the Israeli hostages. And I think what happened with these 6 hostages who were alive and should have been coming home to their families should teach us not to play this game. This is too risky. If the lives of the hostages are really important to us, if Israel truly is a society, a country which sanctifies life, we're playing huge risks with the lives of our citizens right now, every day in Gaza. And I have said from day one of this war, the longer they stay in Gaza, the bigger the risk there is to their lives. And I think we've seen that too many times already.
So in the current conditions, what can Israel agree to basically? You said yourself, Hamas are with their backs against the wall. Their army is dismantled. On their side, the hostages with Yahya Sinwar alive or dead are basically their insurance policy. Now, Israel has defined the war objective of destroying Hamas. Without knowing the details of the deal, anything that Israel will give them now is going to be their string to pull themselves out of the water, metaphorically. their last whatever out of Philadelphia. So where is the balance between this and Israel's military goals? I'm aware that the defense minister said that Israel should not stay in the Philadelphia deal, in the Philadelphia corridor, and that the rest of the cabinet voted for it, and that was the route decided on Thursday. But on the other hand, the Philadelphia corridor is also a main artery of weapons importation into Gaza. So how do we get around that, you know?
Listen, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. And if we are, we'll also understand what Minister of Defense Gallant said a couple of weeks ago. There is no absolute victory here. There is no military victory against Hamas. You cannot defeat an organization, an ideology, and an idea with the military. We can challenge Hamas with politics, with a different option, a better ideology for the Palestinian people. That's what needs to be done. The longer we stay in Gaza, the longer Israeli soldiers are in Gaza, the more of those soldiers will come home in body bags. We saw 10 of them being killed last week. The longer Israel stays in Gaza, the more armed insurgency there will be. They don't need to have an organized army. It's enough for them to come out of a tunnel or out of a building and shoot an RPG at Israeli soldiers and kill 1, 2, or more every single day. We were in Lebanon for 18 years with this belief that through our military strength, we can defeat Hezbollah. Well, we didn't defeat Hezbollah. 18 years, we had a lot of Israeli soldiers killed. The Philadelphia corridor is also another one of these myths. The corridor has two sides to it. And it's true that perhaps Israel doesn't trust the Egyptian army because they can be bribed. But I think we do trust the Americans. And the Americans are prepared to provide finance, technology, and boots on the ground to inspect and ensure that the Philadelphia corridor is sealed hermetically. The Egyptians maintain that there was no smuggling of arms through the Philadelphia corridor since Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over the government in Egypt. They claim that they closed all those tunnels. There were hundreds of tunnels prior to Sisi taking over after the Muslim Brotherhood had won the elections in Egypt. I don't know if this is true or not. It's irrelevant. The evidence that we've seen from the Israeli side is we've seen tunnels on the Gaza side of the border that end at the wall. So maybe the Egyptian claim is correct, but there was the open Rafah crossing where smuggling probably did take place. There's no doubt that that border needs to be closed and smuggling cannot happen, but Israel doesn't have to be there. We need to defeat Hamas by offering the Palestinian people an option of living in peace, of living in dignity, of living in freedom, because Israel will never have security if the Palestinian people don't have freedom, liberation, and dignity. And I remind Palestinians, hold on. I remind Palestinians that they won't have freedom, liberation, and dignity if Israel doesn't have security. So this is a two-way deal. We all need security. We all need freedom and liberation and dignity. That has to be achieved.
But you know what? So let me ask you: how do you see the day after?
Yeah.
Rise in your vision. How do you see the day after? Setting aside, you know, who rules Gaza in the sense of the percentage in how much Hamas, how much PA, how much UAE.
No,
How
listen,
do you see the in the sense of Israel's military, you know, deployment around the Gaza Strip?
First of all, there's no day after scenario for Israel which is acceptable where Hamas continues to control Gaza. But what we have to understand is that for the Palestinian leadership and the majority of the Palestinian people, for our neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, the Bahrainis, and the Saudis, there is no day after tomorrow in Gaza where Hamas is in charge there. We have allies here in this region, and we need to be working with our allies in Palestine and around the region to ensure that Gaza is ruled by an acceptable Palestinian leadership, that there will be a multinational Arab-led peacekeeping force in Gaza after this war to ensure that, one, Gaza is not attacked by Israel, but again, that Gaza is not attacking Israel. And let's put the facts on the table. We're not talking about facing the Russian army in Gaza. We're talking about a reality in which, had there been 10, 15 tanks on the border and 3 helicopters in the air, October 7th wouldn't have happened. October 7th happened because we were not there. The Israeli army was not on the border. We were not protected because of hubris, because of failed conception that they were deterred. I've been saying since 2008, you can't deter people who believe it's their religious commitment to die as martyrs for the cause. What do? Threaten we're going to kill you? That's exactly what we've been saying to Hamas, and there's never been deterrence against Hamas. And we need to understand who the enemy is. But we also need to not inflate the danger and the risk to Israel. October 7th cannot happen again if we protect our borders. The danger now is that something like that could happen from the West Bank, because the longer the war goes on in Gaza, the more events of terrorism we're going to see in the West Bank. The West Bank is being inflamed now because of the continuation of the war in Gaza. The war with Hezbollah will continue as long as the war in Gaza continues, and the threat of Iran continues as long as the war in Gaza continues.
So we basically agree that, let's say there's like, beyond the tactical strategic calculations in Gaza, in Philadelphia corridor, etc., in the goal of destroying Hamas completely or what, it's an obvious thing that you cannot destroy an idea. There's a metaphysical and ideological, or let's say a message element to this, which is now much bigger than this. If this was indeed contained to just the southern Gaza Strip, but the people who are against the hostage deal from July 2nd, which is no longer relevant because they killed some of the hostages, are against ceding to Hamas demands, say this is going to send a message to Hezbollah, to the West Bank, to other Iranian proxies. I perfectly understand that there are political considerations at play, but these political considerations sometimes mesh with what some of the generals at least, say are real tactical calculations. I mean, can Israel actually trust the Americans to keep it along the Gaza-Egypt border? Is that deal actually sealed and hermetic in a sense that we can sleep tightly with it?
The problem is not the Philadelphia corridor. The Philadelphia corridor can be secured. There are deals that can be made politically when there's a political will to make a deal that will ensure our security much better than we ensure it today. Israel lost its deterrence on October 7th when the people in the region who are enemies saw how easy it was to breach that border. I think part of the deterrence has been regained by the total destruction of Gaza that we've done there. What happened in Gaza, where 2 million people are now homeless and have no place to go back to, all the infrastructure destroyed, I think we went overboard by a lot in what we did in Gaza. We didn't need to do the total destruction that we did. But I think the message is very clear to the Lebanese, who you saw what happened in Lebanon when the Lebanese people thought that Hezbollah was going to instigate a full-scale war with Israel. People were running away from Lebanon, from Beirut. They were running to the hills, and they left the country as quickly as they could. I think the message is clear there. I think the Iranians have a pretty good idea, not only of Israel's power, but the fact that there were 2 U.S. armed aircraft carriers off the coast in the Red Sea and in the Arab Gulf. I think that the Iranians understand that the U.S. and other allies have our back if they attack. What we need to understand is that we have no future here of ever living in security if we don't come to terms with the Palestinian issue. Netanyahu thought that we could remove it, erase it, reduce it, ignore it since 2009, and on October 7th that blew up in our face. We cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. There is a solution on the table. It is a 2-state solution. There is no better solution for the state of Israel, not a 1-state solution, which we don't want. The 2-state solution preserves Israel as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, where there must be equality for the 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel too. But there must be a state of Palestine living in peace next to Israel. And we need to learn the lessons from the failure of Oslo. We need not to make the mistakes that we made in Oslo. We need to move forward cautiously, but in a determined way to end this conflict. This war must be the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We cannot continue to do this.
How do you get around? I mean, it looks from the last time hostages were released in the first round, you saw the civilian population in Gaza, and it looks like since 2007, since the Hamas takeover of the Strip, the indoctrination through education of the population has been a tremendous success. I mean, it's going to be quite a hard sell. You're talking about this, we're not talking about the PA. I understand the general tone of what you're saying, but how do you get around, how do you get to do that after October 7th? Where do you even draw the border?
I'll tell you where and how we do it. One is that we have to understand that the Palestinians in Gaza are part of the Palestinian people. There are no two Palestinian peoples. There's the Palestinian people, they're in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and there are Palestinian Israelis too. And we need to understand what their needs are and what their demands are and see how we can meet those needs and demands in a way that does not risk our security, in a way that we're not committing suicide. You know, peace
Hamas, this
education.
doesn't happen though. Hamas is
No,
an
I'm not
ideological.
talking about Hamas. We're not going to do it, Hamas. Hamas is not a partner for peace, but there are Palestinians are. There's not going to be an ability to enter into a real peace process with Hamas ever, or with Gaza, until there's some kind of stability in Gaza. There is an alternative Palestinian leadership which is willing to step in as a temporary leadership in Gaza, appointed by the Palestinian Authority, not the Palestinian Authority themselves. People supported by Dahlan, people supported by
Who will
Marwan
secure them
Barghouti.
militarily apart from Israeli spears?
There needs to be an agreement that there will be a multinational Arab-led force that will come to Gaza for a limited period of time of about 2 years to stabilize the situation, to work with the Palestinian ruling government there to disarm Hamas, because the Palestinians accept the idea that a future Palestinian state will be non-militarized. But what we need to do from the very beginning of the process, what we didn't do in Oslo, is begin the process with an agreement on both sides that we will engage in reevaluating our peace educational curriculum and textbooks on both sides. We need to agree on criteria, and then each side needs to go directly and do an investigation and a review of how we teach, what we teach to our children, because that's a reflection of what we really believe in. And
What
then
we teach to our children, you're saying.
we don't teach our children peace, and we don't teach our children in Israel anything about the Palestinians.
Okay, I
The
mean,
Palestinians don't teach anything about Israel or anything good about Israel or about the rights of the Jewish people to be here. And we need to recognize that for both people, this land is their homeland. Another very simple thing that we need to do is we need to learn each other's language. We need to do that from grade 1. That
I
needs to
agree,
be part of our education. That will reflect a big change in how we view each other. If we all learn Hebrew and Arabic from grade 1 and we relate to Hebrew and Arabic as we do to the English language, for example.
okay, listen, Gershon, doing the math, there are 66 hostages who are, at best, 66 hostages still alive.
We don't know. We don't know how many are alive. There are
That's, yeah, I mean,
we don't know.
okay, there are 101, I think, hostages left, and the
Right.
army assumes 35. I don't know if it's like the remote forensics method they developed or whatever.
We don't know.
Do you see, considering everything you said about Hamas and about, I don't know who you talked to there, but about the way the organization works, its ideology, it's non-compromise on anything at all. Do you see any deal now? Forget everything you said about education, etc. In the coming weeks, that can be had.
there's a deal that's
We
on
will
the
see
table.
all of them returned, all of them, including the dead ones, that can be implemented, or will any phase deal should be considered, according to what you said by Israel, as a deal where only the first phase will actually be realized, and then the rest is going to be kind of smeared by Hamas over months and years, and.
The deal that's on the table is a bad deal, and we need to scrap it. The deal that Hamas told me that they would accept, and I suggest that we don't believe them. I suggest that we ask, that we, the negotiators in Israel, ask the Qataris and the Egyptians to ask Hamas, will you agree to what you told Gershon Baskin, which is
We have like 5 minutes left. Can you just, in a few bullets, tell me what's the deal?
I'm going to tell you exactly what the deal is that they told me they would accept. 3 weeks, end the war, Israel withdraws from Gaza. They will free all the hostages, all 101 hostages that are remaining there, and there'll be a release of an agreed number and names of Palestinian prisoners. That's the deal. It's there on the table. All that needs to happen right now is that the Israeli negotiators need to ask the Qataris and the Egyptians to ask Hamas if they agree to it. The person that I talked to, who is a member of the Hamas negotiating team and a member of their leadership, told me that the entire Hamas leadership agrees to it. That needs to be tested. Don't believe me. It's not coming from Gershon Baskin. It has to come from Hamas. And Hamas told me that they will say yes if they're asked by the Qataris and the Egyptians. That's where it is. And if they say yes, The Israeli negotiators need to come and tell the people of Israel and put it on the government's table and say there is a deal that will save all the Israeli hostages, all 101 of them. It requires Israel to end the war and withdraw from Gaza and release Palestinian prisoners. That's the deal. Let's vote on it. Let's
Do
put
they
it
ask for
together.
do they ask for any guarantees, either for Sinwar personally or the
We didn't
leadership?
talk about any guarantees. Sinwar knows that eventually he's going to be killed in battle with Israel. He's not afraid to that. That's his commandment, his belief. He will take as many Israelis along with him that he can.
What about the commitment to ending the war? Do they insist on a worded commitment to
They're
release
not going to
all
release Israeli hostages until Israel withdraws from Gaza. And
fully?
we're not going to release Palestinian prisoners until they start releasing Israeli hostages. That's the deal. The war has to end. Israel has to leave Gaza. There are no guarantees that Israel won't go back to Gaza. If they violate the agreement or if they shoot rockets at Israel, Israel will go back and be justified to go back. And after this deal is done, we need to put on our thinking caps and start working on this problem politically, which probably means getting rid of Netanyahu. We need to go to elections. We need a national committee of investigation to determine who's responsible and what's responsible for what led us to October 7th and the failure of the Israeli government since October 7th. We need new leadership, and all those responsible for October 7th in the army, in the intelligence, in the politics need to go home. They need to take responsibility like any normal democratic country would. They would stand up and resign and take responsibility. We need new leaders here. The Palestinians need new leaders. They need to go to elections. We need a new generation of Israelis and Palestinians who have the ability to begin to look forward and not just backwards.
We should remember though that years before Netanyahu, as your shirt says, it's for the Jews, for the Jewish state, this patent pending of kidnapping a few hostages and exchanging them for thousands has started in the 80s, and it's very sad that it's the modus operandi of Israel's enemies for decades, and I don't think that's dependent on who's the prime minister here.
Let's remember, though, that Gilad Shalit was in captivity for 5 years and 4 months before a decision was made to bring him home. He was the Israeli held in captivity more than any other Israeli before him. So we can pat ourselves on the back and talk about how noble and generous we are and how we're willing to release 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for him, of which 300 of them had killed Israelis. But we took 5 years and 4 months before we were willing to do that.
Understand. Okay, thank you for that. I have a question from a reporter, which is very political. I'm going to pass it through anyway. Can you tell me why, in your mind, do you think the Likud seems to be gaining in polls recently?
Yeah, I think the main reason is that there's no opposition in Israel. We have no opposition that presents any kind of vision, any kind of horizon, any kind of hope. The leaders of the opposition are not inspiring people, and they are not acting as a functioning opposition, providing the Israeli public with an alternative. But Netanyahu also gets credit for the assassinations that were done. He gets credit for the speech that he made in Congress. His base is gaining support. He's always had about a 30% solid support in Israel, and he's regaining part of that base in the absence of an opposition and an alternative. And that's the reason why. Not because people love Benjamin Netanyahu. He needs to be kicked out of his office for the responsibility that he holds for the disaster of October 7th.
Okay, another question from a reporter. You published your lengthy Twitter account, the X post, yesterday, just some hours before the bodies were retrieved. He's asking, why are you speaking out now? What's like, why take that moment to speak out?
I always prefer to work in secret direct back channels. They are the most effective ways of usually working, but we have a reality in which our prime minister is not willing to end the war. One of the head negotiators in Israel, when I transmitted to him what Hamas told me they were willing to agree to, responded to me, but Netanyahu is not willing to end the war. If that's the response of the chief negotiators, and they're not willing to challenge Netanyahu with an alternative plan that frees all the hostages, then I decided to go public. It's not something that I generally do in these circumstances, but I believe that the Israeli public needs to raise its voice and make demands on the government that haven't been made until now. I don't know if it will be effective. I don't know if my going public will help to bring the hostages home. I felt frustrated to the point where I felt that the public has a right to know that there might be an alternative. There might be an option to negotiate a deal with Hamas that will bring the hostages home. And that's why I decided to go public.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I certainly don't think the Israeli public is not is not divided on this. I think it's an issue. There are many opinions, and it's actually tearing us apart very sadly. I thank you again for your time, and I hope to see you under better conditions, in better terms.
Thank you.